I'm Aromar Revi, the director of IIHS, the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. My own research lies at the confluence of three rather diverse areas: sustainability science, climate science, the work that we do at the IPCC, and what is now being called new urban science. A lot of people sort of, ask us what new urban science is and where is it actually going. So this has been a space that people have been exploring for a while, but in a paper that a number of us wrote in 2016 in Nature, which was building on the momentum at that point of time after Habitat 3, talked about the role of science in trying to help address some of the great questions that urbanization is, in a sense, asking us in different parts of the world, and the importance of scientists and the engagement of science in sort of addressing them. But more than that, I guess there is a sort of historical context. In 2015 and 16, we had a confluence of a whole range of international agreements, starting with the Sustainable Development Goals that set up a larger framework within which cities were important. So one of the core questions is, how does space and urbanization or sustainable cities actually connect to health, education, poverty, hunger, dealing with environmental challenges like climate change, biodiversity, conservation, etc. So that's one set of questions. The second, of course, comes from the New Urban Agenda, which was established or brought together in 2016, about a year after the SDGs came into place. So trying to spatialize development, to try and look at what the context is in which these significant, in a sense, millennial trends are playing themselves around. And then you have the Sendai framework that looks at disaster risk, that looks at extreme events within this context, both nationally and in local contexts, because a lot of risk is concentrated in urban areas. And then finally, we have the Paris Climate Agreement, which in a sense sort of challenges us to deal with one of the most significant, I would say, existential challenges that we have in the world, in which cities and regions play not only a significant part of the problem, but also in some senses are a very critical element in trying to address the questions of climate and climate change. So urban science is, let's say, a set of practices, of knowledges that is coming together to address the interconnections within these four broad sort of regimes or sets of engagement and between them. In that sense, it is a deeply interdisciplinary field. As it builds out, at some point of time, people may actually call it a transdisciplinary area, because it brings together things from a whole range, I would say at least 2 or 3 dozen disciplines to try and address these questions. This, of course, comes from our experience that cities have been around for a long time, but we don't really understand their dynamics, their interrelationships as well as we could. And in a world in which more than half the world population is living in urban areas, in which 2/3 to 3/4 of the economic output of countries and regions comes from urban areas, the bulk of the emissions of the world come from urban consumption and production. And of course, a lot of the new incremental employment comes from these areas. So there are places in which, in a sense, not only the future of the world, but certainly of young people actually sits in. So urban science, whether it looks at it from an analytical point of view or looks at it from a social science point of view, or even from the point of view of the humanities, will give us, or is starting to give us, insights on the dynamics and changes and transformations that are required in this space. So in peak, we've been lucky to bring together some of the best researchers in the world from, let's say, canonical institutions like Oxford and new emergent institutions that are actually starting to change the way that both the engagement with actual reality, the policy space, and in a sense knowledge are emerging in India, in China, with Beta, with IIHS, and in Medellin, with EFIT, and of course in South Africa with the University of Cape Town, which is a sort of the oldest university in Africa. So bringing together sort of seasoned academics and researchers, and of course an entire new generation of postdoctoral and sort of master's level, advanced master's level researchers, is in our hope going to be able to create a cohort of people who not only are exploring the boundaries of where knowledge is in their own particular context and their disciplines, but also work together to try and address these problems as they sort of are juxtaposed with, as they challenge each other in multiple locations. Having said that, what are the kind of examples that we're trying to address? What are the kind of questions that we're trying to address? And I'll try and touch on a few of them. One, of course, is the question of how we organize economic activities in space. So the way that a lot of economics, and certainly a lot of economic policy, is organized is largely aspatial. So it's looked at sectorally. So you look at what happens in agriculture, or what happens in industry, or what happens in particular kinds of services. But we know from a world that is fairly large and very dense and full of people, that these activities actually cluster in space. And the clustering in space is something that gives you tremendous economies of scale and scope in urban areas across the world, China being the most remarkable example we've seen over the last 20-25 years or so of a complete transformation of an economy, suddenly catapulting itself from being a low middle income country to becoming almost a high income country in a very, very short period of time, driven by the processes of urbanization. So trying to understand how the structure of output, of economic output, of technology, innovation, infrastructure, total factor productivity, and how employment is actually organized, and where the synergies and where the trade-offs and the conflicts actually emerge, is one of the core questions that we're trying to address in urban science across the entire spectrum, going from smaller places all the way to mega urban regions of maybe 10, 15, 20, in some cases 40, 50 million people. So that's one kind of a question that we're trying to get a handle on in multiple geographies. The other critical kind of issues that we try and deal with are within the city. What is the nature of spatial inequality? How do things actually relate to themselves? Because it's very nice to say, as we've said in the Sustainable Development Goals, that the goals will be met by leaving no one behind. But in actual practice, we know that you cannot address leaving no one behind without dealing with questions of spatial inequality, dealing with the question of leaving no place behind, whether it is a neighborhood inside a city, or let's say a region and a whole country, or multiple regions across the world where inequality or lack of access or poverty, etc., become exacerbated. So looking at inequality in some senses across the world at different scales and shapes and sizes is an important question. Another critical question is, how do you govern large or even smaller places in a very complex world which is deeply interconnected? So historically, it was not very difficult to do. You had nation states, and then you have provinces, and then you had maybe some urban areas, and there was a hierarchy that was established. And in some senses, things were maintained within that hierarchy, with, of course, lots of debates about decentralization or devolution, and how do you balance centrality versus things that happen at the periphery. But in a world today that is not only complex but highly interconnected, where a whole range of emergent processes and behaviors actually play themselves out, it's important for us to get a sense of what forms of governance can actually play itself out. And you can see this happening in many places. There is a live and active contest between cities and regions, and of course hegemonic nation states, about 190 of them that make up the United Nations. And I think one of the questions that we're trying to address within PEAK is, if we have to achieve these remarkable goals that the countries have agreed among themselves in the next 10, 11 years or so, somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 days, then what are the kind of relationships that countries and regions and cities will actually have within the countries, and of course between them? Because we know that innovation and process and the actual integration of action around sort of local interests is one of the big conundrums of trying to sort of embrace new forms of governance that are emerging in the early and mid 21st century. Other very practical questions: how does one deal with in a country, let's say for example like India, which is largely rural, as we become more and more urban? How does one move from a comprehensive healthcare system, which is largely addressing rural questions, which are highly decentralized, which have a large number of places that have to be addressed? When that transitions to having more and more people in urban areas, what kind of a structure will you adopt? What kind of systems and processes would you work with? What kinds of patterns of disease and nutrition would you try and address? And how would that sit in with the question of, how your spatial structure is organized, where the resources would come from, what the governance frame would be like, and how you would finance it. So this is a classic, sectoral question, but you have to look at it spatially. And we're looking at this in multiple locations, certainly in Bangalore, also in Cape Town, and potentially in maybe Medellin and in Beijing. What interest has this as far as we're concerned? I mean, IIHS, as a partner in this process, is of course probably the first university in the world that is centrally about urbanization. We're probably the only interdisciplinary university of our kind that's looking at urbanization as a rubric around which we try to bring together the questions of how you can bring about change at scale, how you can enable transformation of a whole range of systems around the questions of urbanization. So in some senses, urban science sits at the heart of what we do, of the multiple practices and the 40 odd disciplines that we try and bring together. And as it evolves, I guess we will also evolve as an institution, and Peak in some senses is a seed that we hope is going to grow into a forest of new ideas, new ways of doing things, and new practices which can actually make a significant difference to hundreds of millions of people across the world.